Okay, this is part two. I should have specified in the last clip that there was going to be part two because I did begin saying I'm going to do the first four albums of Pink Floyd, but kind of ran out of steam, and I'm sure you, if you were watching, probably thought, let's have a break, which I do when I teach, say, let's have a break. Can only take in so much. So I'm following up. I talked about in the previous clip, Piper at the Gates of Dawn and A Saucer Full of Secrets, and the two singles that came about at that time, which were See Emily Play and Arnold Lane. In the other direction, Arnold Lane and See Emily Play. So now I'm going to talk about the next two albums. Mainly More, amazing psychedelic cover there. Ostensibly a soundtrack album, but very much part of the Pink Floyd oeuvre. And following that up, Ummagumma, which has an amazing cover, and with the various band members disappearing into the mirror. And then on the back showing their equipment that they used, all very much Roger Waters architecture students, putting it all in a nice, coherent, systematic, nice sense of symmetry there. Very different from Syd Barrett, who I'm sure just threw his guitar on the floor rather than doing that. And then on the original inner sleeve, we have the band, David Gilmour in a rock setting, and Roger Waters with his wife, or girlfriend at the time, which they got rid of on the CD reissue. So that's no longer there, which I could show you. But anyway, they got a different picture there because obviously Roger Waters no longer wants her on that album cover because they broke up many years ago. But let's talk about the music, shall we? The thing to think about before the album More came out, or after Saucer Full of Secrets. So Syd Barrett was on that album, as I said, in Jugland Blues, but he certainly wasn't on any of the other albums that followed. And Gilmour and Waters pretty much recorded his solo albums at Abbey Road during that same time period, produced them. And some people have said that Gilmour was a bit nasty in leaving Opal off the first album, even though it was recorded and was obviously the most remarkable song. But maybe they were unconsciously trying to sabotage Syd Barrett's solo career. Who knows? It was nice of them to record him, and I'm sure he was very difficult to record, which is what Gilmour has said. And Rick Wright plays on the second Barrett album. But before that, they had a single together, Apples and Oranges, which I think is one of the most weakest Pink Floyd songs, and therefore kind of undermines the theory that without Syd Barrett they were terrible, but with Syd Barrett they were great. Syd Barrett's songwriting had got wayward. I think the two solo albums are both great, but yes, I certainly think Apples and Oranges wasn't a good single. He had pressures on him to write a single, a follow-up single to See Emily Play. And yeah, it's a bad song. It doesn't have any of the qualities that are on those first two singles. And it's schizophrenic like the first singles, but without any of that kind of cohesive joy and... I guess there's something in those first two singles that seem, there's a structure in them, even though they are bringing about many different elements and sensibilities to them. There's a structure to them. Whereas Apples and Oranges doesn't seem to be about anything in particular, and doesn't have that wonderful kind of movement from the abstract to the intimately personal. You're the kind of girl that fits into my world. Doesn't have that. Apples and Oranges, it's mainly, I don't even want to really talk about it too much. And again, they follow that up. There was two singles without Barrett, which have also come in for a lot of flack. And also the band obviously didn't like them very much because they've taken ages for them to release them. But It Would Be So Nice, and with the B-side Julia Dream, which is a remarkable song, better than the single, and Point Me at the Sky was the other one, which is a great fun song, and Careful with That Axe, Eugene, another great song. So maybe the B-sides are better than the A-sides on these. But I think it would be so nice, and Point Me at the Sky are great singles at the time. They're not Pink Floyd's greatest work, but they're fun. And I think Nick Mason is playing both these songs, or at least Point Me at the Sky on the tour that he's doing now, which I think is great that he's playing the early stuff and not just flogging Dark Side of the Moon or The Wall for another time, which Waters would be wanting to do. I think it was great that Waters turned up and sang Set the Controls on the Heart of the Sun at one of those concerts, and saw the audience there who love this stuff, which he's quite, derogatory about. So anyway, those singles were kind of like almost like a period of transition that they were, well, they really went nowhere because they were trying to continue that pop single sound and realised, no, we're better at doing full playing albums. So to look at it from a sociological perspective, you could say, well, they were using the popular music low art form, the 45 single, and then they moved from the low art to, you could argue, the high art of the serious music, using classical elements, extending their range and trying to do something a bit more arty-farty, as Pete Townsend might say. Remember that these were the years that Tommy was being cooked up, and Village Green Preservation Society and Astral Weeks, which I could talk about forever, but we're not going to do that now. So I actually wrote a review of the album More on All Music Guide, I think it was. So I really like this album, and again, you could argue that it's not one of the greatest Pink Floyd albums. It was a soundtrack album. It was done very quickly. But I think it really taps into a new sort of style of songwriting that they hadn't done before. And yeah, so More, it's mainly Roger Waters wrote nearly all the songs that are songs, if you want to talk about songs. But it's also very much a collaborative piece, which The Saucer Full of Secrets certainly was too. So if we're looking at the songs that are on this album, I would say Cirrus Minor is a great piece of music. Very slow, but very beguiling, very I'm looking for adjectives here. Sludgy. It's very trippy. It's quintessentially a 60s song, but again, it's got that the sensibility of nature to it. It's got a very tapping into the inner churchyard by a river, lazing down in the midday, maybe connected to Cambridge University again, which would have had the churches around there. And again, it's got an astounding ending where Rick Wright just plays this organ piece at the end that is almost like a separate movement that perhaps is the whole song's leading to that moment where Rick Wright does this incredible organ piece at the end. Then we have the Nile song, and there's another song, is it on the second side, the Ibiza Bar, I think, that's pretty much very similar to the Nile song. And again, a lot of people love this straightforward rock and roll type song that they do. I'm not a great fan of it, but it's okay. Obviously a totally different sound to what they'd done, moving out of the psychedelic sort of instrumentation and into a straightforward sort of 70s rock feel that would predominate on Dark Side of the Moon. And Gilmour sort of screeching or yelling rather than singing. After Cirrus Minor, which is very tranquil and soft, it's a big stark wake-up call. And then we go back to the much more mellow, the Crying song, and Cymbeline is another song that they actually played quite a bit in concert. But I guess the standout track is Green is the Colour, which is just a great song, well-structured song, well-written song, and is very much bucolic, rustic, again maybe influenced by the Cambridge countryside. Ultimately a straightforward love song, which they hadn't written up to that point. So Waters is stretching out his songwriting sensibilities here. His songwriting ability at that stage was quite obviously just a few Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun and the first track off the first album. So he's developing as a songwriter here. And the others certainly are accredited for writing what tends to be the instrumentals passages on the second side of the album, which again I think are really nice. And nice is not a word you want to hear when someone describes your music, but I think if I look at my original review in All Music Guide, I put there is something about this album that makes for a really satisfying listening experience. Totally uncontrived and unpretentious, so if you want to juxtapose that with The Wall or something. Unlike their later albums, some of Waters' most beguiling and beautiful songs, Green is the Colour, Cirrus Minor, The Crying Song, Cymbeline, some of the instrumentals are a bit half-baked, but it all works as a whole in creating an indelible, pantheistic, psychedelic atmosphere. Cirrus Minor especially comes across as a hymn to nature, in a churchyard by a river, lying in the haze of midday. Yeah, so that was my review. I'm going to use a bit of that as I've already done it. So I would agree with all of that. I have watched the film. It's part of the box set, the early years that you can get now. You can buy it separately or as one massive box set. And the movie's better, I think, than the other movie, The Valley, which is unwatchable, I think. So more, yeah, not a great movie, very much a movie of its time. But I think the soundtrack's certainly much more long-lasting than the film. And it's great that it's part of the canon, Pink Floyd, that it fits in. So I would say this, what they weren't faltering around the dark here. I think this is a great soundtrack album and holds up on its own and should be number 3 in the list of albums. Now, the 4th album is Ummagumma, which I've showed before. So this album is half a live album, recorded at Mother's Birmingham, Manchester College of Commerce, and it's got just 4 songs on it. But it's, to me, one of the great live albums ever, and certainly showcases those songs. So you've got Astronomy Domine, Careful with That Axe, Eugene, Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun, and A Saucerful of Secrets. And these recordings are better than the ones on the album, bar perhaps the first track, which Piper at the Gates of Dawn may be slightly better. But the other, they stretch out in these versions, and they really stand on their own. So it's a great live album, certainly a million times better than the very rudimentary and unsatisfying live albums they brought out later on without Waters, Pulse, and Delicate Sound of Thunder, which I know they've remastered and reissued, and they're a little bit better than I remember, but they're certainly not as mind-blowingly great as this early album. And this is, if you had to give someone one Pink Floyd album, I'd give them the first album of Ummagumma. It's only got 4 songs, but they just the way they stretch out in the instrumental passages is fantastic. And Rick Wright's organ too, his keyboard playing throughout is fantastic. Again, I should be using more music critic language here, but I'm just doing this quickly and off the cuff. I don't want to get bogged down with the high culture language either. I want to make this understandable. So Richard Wright's keyboard sounds and organ playing was fantastic. Mind-blowing. We can do better than that, I'm sure. But yeah, ethereal. Ethereal, there we go, there's a word. Ethereal organ playing. So that's, like, it's got a great live album as standalone, and then we've got the instrumental album, which a lot of people critique and say is pretty subpar. And Gilmour said they were not farting in the dark, but certainly not pissing in the wind, but, you know, they weren't sure of what they were doing. But I would argue the studio album is pretty good. Like, the first album, the first side 3 with Richard Wright's, he calls it rather pretentious. Well, the name perhaps, Sisyphus, the myth of Sisyphus, pushing the boulder up the mountain, and don't know that it has much to do with the music. But I think Richard Wright's piece on this is fantastic. I love it. Again, I've used the word fantastic. Works as a piece of music that stands on its own. And then we have Roger Waters' Grantchester Meadows and several species of small furry animals gathered together in a cave and grooving with a pict. Both of these songs are mainly music collages of different noises and sounds. But I think, yeah, he did that album with Ron Geeson around this time called The Body, which if you want to check that out, it's worth listening to. The first Roger Waters solo album where he uses sticky tape, sounds on sticky tape being stretched and people hitting pens and tapping glass and so on and so forth. For Ron Geeson, who went on to write or at least produce the Atom Heart Mother, well, the orchestral part of that album, did that album with Roger Waters, which was, I think, around this time or just after Ummagumma. So obviously Several Species has that same musicality about it. It's using a whole lot of different noises and sounds rather than instruments playing music, so on. But it's thinking of the technology that they had back then, it's quite remarkable that he was able to record this without Pro Tools and using, again, Brian Wilson was doing Smile around the same time, using tiny little fragments of music and modular music making, I think it's called, modular music making, and yeah, connecting tiny little parts to a cohesive whole, we hope. So I think that, and Grantchester Meadows is very much could have ended up on more, it's very much sounds like Cirrus Minor or something, finger picking. There's a great clip on YouTube of him and David Gilmour doing it, and they look like Simon and Garfunkel. Very different sound to the freak out psychedelia nursery rhymes of the first albums. So again, they're progressing very quickly here from being one type of band to a very different band. And again, it might be pissing in the wind and going down a dead end, but it's an interesting dead end. They could have milked this for albums and albums and albums. They could have become a finger-picking, James Taylor-esque type of band, but they didn't. Now, side 4, we have David Gilmour, The Narrow Way, that I used to think was a bit ho-hum, but having got the box set, the early years, and having heard a couple of early versions of it, I think it stands up. It's a good piece of songwriting. Well, it's a decent piece of songwriting for David Gilmour. I think it's the first song he wrote that's on a Pink Floyd album. And famously asked Roger Waters to help with the lyrics for it. And he said that Roger just flatly said no. So, yeah, that wonderful sense of collaboration. I almost think that Waters made this album just to show I am the best. He gave them each half a side of an album and said, none of us are going to help each other. We're all going to stand alone, and we'll see who are the really great songwriters. And in a way, he kind of won. His music is the best of the 4, but the competitive bastard that he was. Anyway, so The Narrow Way has a descending sort of droning type feel, and it's got some great guitar on it, slide guitar. Psychedelic would be a good word to describe it. If you had a particular big spliff and you wanted to trip out, it's a good song for that. Lyrically, Gilmour didn't get Waters to help, so he struggled with the lyrics, and therefore they're buried in the mix. I don't know what he's going on about, but it's called The Narrow Way. Polly didn't write them. Won't go on about that now. So, and the last piece, Nick Mason. Well, if you want to pretentious, but there's a part 1, 2, and 3, the Grand Vizier's Garden Party. Yeah, there's not a lot you can say about Masons. I have a lot of time for Nick Mason. I love the way he's sort of taken on his duty, like Bill Wyman in the Stones, of keeping the flame alive on this early music. And I think his wife played a flute piece on this. So there's this sort of flute, might even be a Moog playing the flute, or there is a real flute on it. And then Mason sort of thrashing around on the drums. This isn't John Bottom. He's mainly using the drums as a sound rather than trying to do anything remarkable on the drums themselves. And again, let's point out quickly that Nick Mason is a great drummer for Pink Floyd. I think he, like Ringo, is underlooked or overlooked, overlooked in his ability to play drums. His drumming is fantastic on these early albums. Watch him at Pompeii too. Obviously, yeah, every time he does a fill, he tends to stop using the foot drum, which may be a limitation, but it tends to... He goes for a fill and then everything sort of stops as far as the bass drum kicking the song along, which gives it that unique sound. But I certainly think his use of the tom-toms in these early albums are fantastic and give it that particular sound that Ringo maybe invented on Sgt. Pepper's. Anyway, the miking of the toms, giving the tom-toms a real prominence that certainly wasn't recorded in music before. It tended to focus on the snare and the hi-hats, and the toms would just be there. But obviously in the 70s, if you listen to Ziggy Stardust, they really emphasised the tom-toms. But Nick Mason maybe innovated that sound. Maybe that's his innovation. But alas, his piece on Ummagumma isn't great. But that's the only flaw, I would say, in the whole album. The live album, 5 stars. Rick Wright's piece is great as a fanfare. We once played a gig somewhere where we used that as a fanfare when we were coming on stage. If you're an up-and-coming band and you want some music to play while you're walking up on stage, use that. Grantchester Meadows, Waters' music's innovative and, yep, great. Grantchester Meadows could have been on more. Gilmour again, not growing on me, and Nick Mason. So the studio album, to me, does work with the live album and makes up a great double album. It's the only double, well, they do The Wall. So, but yeah, it's, so they really had 2 double albums. But yeah, I guess it's a live album and the studio album, so it doesn't count. But anyway, worth checking out. Lastly, I would like to mention these 2 albums. Relics, which came out quite a bit later, but has music, the songs that were left off the main albums. And there's a different cover on the CD. I think Nick Mason, there's also one that Nick Mason drew the illustration for. Anyway, I'm going to look at the vinyl version, a bizarre collection of antiques and curios. So we've got the Arnold Layne single. What else? See 'Em They Play. So Paintbox is the one song that isn't on any of the other albums. And that's a great Rick Wright song, which I love. It's got some funny lyrics in it. Getting awfully angry at him. He keeps her waiting somewhere and she's feeling rather angry. And great drumming from Mason. I think he's using the rototoms on that before Dark Side of the Moon time. Again, I have a real soft spot for Julia Dream, first track on side 2. This is a beautiful piece of music. And again, it has that outro where Rick Wright just plays an organ piece at the end of the song where you think the song's finished and then it just goes out. And to me, that's heavenly. That's ascending up to Purgatorio or even to Paradiso itself. It's a remarkable piece of music. And it's only 2 minutes and 35. Julia Dream, Dreamboat Queen, Queen of All My Dreams. Fantastic song. Careful with that axe, Eugene. I think this is a different version from the B-side because it's 7 minutes. So it's probably produced by Norman Smith, though. Probably the album version. Cirrus Minor off more, Nile Song off more, Biding My Time, and then Bike. So Bike is off the first album. So it's really Biding My Time and Paintbox and Julia Dream that you probably wouldn't have if you didn't have the albums. Biding My Time is pretty awful too. I'd put that along with Corporal Cleggers. They did a similar song on Metal, As I Reach for a Peach, Saint-Tropez. Yeah, look, Water's getting jazzy, not a good thing. I'm glad they didn't, plough that field for too long because I don't think it's a good musical genre or area that they should have worked with. So it's Biding My Time. It's got a cracking great Gilmour solo at the end. And again, Mason's drumming. Amazing. So if you cut the song in half and just listen to the second half, might be good. Lastly, this is a bootleg album which I bought when I was about 18 or 16, called Before Time Began, and that's got half Syd Barrett sort of songs that aren't on the albums and half David Gilmour. So just when they were splitting up. And the songs here again, Apples and Oranges, It Would Be So Nice, Candy in a Currant Bun. It does have Scream Thy Last Scream. Doesn't have Vegetable Man, but let me mention those 2 songs because that kind of finishes up the Syd Barrett era. I have a real soft spot for Vegetable Man. I think that's another great song that illustrates the disintegration of Syd Barrett's mind. In Yellow Shoes I Get the Blues, with my velvet trousers, and there's something, the stink about pink. Oh, I don't know it off the top of my head. But it's him describing himself in almost the third person, and then the chorus is just Vegetable Man. So a frightening song, really, considering he was disintegrating into schizophrenia and bipolar. And then it kind of just goes into a Batman type jam at the end. But it's a great song, and it's good that they finally brought that out on the box set, the early years. And then Scream, Thy Last Scream, that to me always reminds me of Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky, which I think is probably based on Raskolnikov, the character, going up and murdering the old woman. Scream, Thy Last Scream, old woman with a casket. So yeah, I think it's based on Crime and Punishment. And Nick Mason sings the vocal. So yeah, it's Nick Mason. Didn't go on to do many other vocals. I think he did one on One of These Days I'm Going to Cut You Into Little Pieces. But yeah, I think that's the lesser song of the two. I think Vegetable Man's better. Scream, Thy Last Scream is madness personified, and kind of sad too to listen to. I'm certainly understand why they didn't release that as a single in the late 60s. But still, again, totally unique. There's nothing else like it. And on the Gilmour side, we've got Heartbeat, Pig Meat, Crumbling Land, which were kind of outtakes from the Zabriskie Point soundtrack, which again, we could talk about, was a soundtrack that they only did they did actually do a whole piece of music for that album, but the director didn't use it, Antonio, whatever his name was. So they've kind of brought out those three songs. He basically got them to do Careful with That Axe, Eugene, another version of that. But again, Grateful Dead had songs on that album. So it's not an official Pink Floyd soundtrack, but it's worth getting now. And again, they brought out a lot of outtakes from that in the box the early years. So you could make a cohesive, complete Pink Floyd soundtrack album now from the Zabriskie Point sessions, which would be interesting, slotting that in just after Ummagumma. And Embryo's the other track, yeah. So Embryo, again, was recorded at the same time as Ummagumma, and they played it live a lot. On the live version, it's really harsh and has a great groove to it and has a whole different sound to the studio version that's really tranquil, not sleep-inducing, but tranquil, relaxing. And that's on the early years box set. And it's a great song too. It could have been on Ummagumma. You could have got rid of the Nick Mason one. But again, they all contributed to that. So it didn't fit the Waters brief that each artist, each person in the band had only one section of the record they could write a song for, only using their own abilities. So it could have been a standalone single, but it probably wouldn't have gone anywhere. But it's a good song, Embryo, and the live and the studio versions are very different. And Mademoiselle Knobs, which we'll talk about when I get to metal. So yeah, Relics is definitely worth getting for those extra tracks that aren't on the albums, even though it's just a few of them. You do want Julia Dream, and you do want Biding My Time, perhaps. Yeah, maybe Embryo should have been on that. There's an album called Rocks, I think, that came out later on that has Embryo on it, the studio one. But the studio one on the early years is much better recording. So I will move on to the next album. So I'll give you a preview. The Difficult Atom Heart Mother, but with one of the great album covers of all time. And Metal. And Obscured by Clouds, another great soundtrack. So until that time, keep listening to Pink Floyd.